My name is Walter Aaron Clark. I was named after my grandfather, who was from Wisconsin, but my father moved to Minnesota when he was a young man. I was the fifth of 5 sons, and they saved my grandfather's name for the last son. I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I spent the first 19 years of my life there. But like many people in Minnesota, I wanted to see the world. I often imagined what the rest of the world must look like. I wanted to see what the clouds looked like in Spain, and it turns out they look pretty much the same way they did in Minnesota, but I'm still glad that I went to see them. My gypsy years were during my 20s when I traveled and finished my education, my undergraduate education, and finally wound up, like so many people, in California. When I was young, the Beatles were very popular. I was 12, 13 years old when the Beatles came to the United States, and so I wanted to play the guitar like George Harrison. I also liked Chuck Berry very much. They were my heroes, and I knew nothing of Spanish music. But one day I heard someone playing flamenco, and I fell completely in love with it. I was 14. I had no inkling of Spain or Spanish culture or the Spanish language or gypsies or anything else. But I heard the Malagueña, and like Paul on the road to Damascus, I had an experience that changed my life. I was able to find a teacher who had just come back from Spain, where he had been studying with Luis Maravilla, one of the great maestros of flamenco. And so I studied with him for several years. While I was in high school, I learned Sevillanas, Bulerías, Granainas, Serranas, Peteneras, Sevillanas, Soleares, Siguerías, this treasure of Spanish music and dance. And I also learned how to accompany singing and dancing. There were several Spanish expatriates in Minneapolis at the time, and they formed a dance company, so I not only learned how to accompany singing and dancing, but I also took dance lessons so that I would be a better accompanist. I actually have a picture of myself dancing the Sevillanas when I was 17. Well, I think that I always knew that I would do something in music. I also studied classical guitar and had a great love of classical music in addition to flamenco. I pretty much gave up on playing rock guitar. And I was a music major in college. I went on to do a master's degree with studying with Pepe Romero at the University of California in San Diego. And I received a Fulbright grant to Europe for 2 years in Germany to study early music. But I'll be brutally honest, I played very well, but I didn't play well enough to have a career. Fortunately for me, I also loved music history. I loved writing. I loved culture. I loved history in general. So I decided to pursue a doctorate in musicology at the University of California, Los Angeles. Fortunately for me as well, there was a very eminent Hispanist at UCLA at the time. His name was Robert Stevenson. He really was the leading musicologist in the study of Spanish and Portuguese and Latin American music. So I worked with him, and well, that changed my life yet again. We use the word genius a lot. I think that we overuse it. I think we abuse it. I think we misuse it. We fail to understand what the word genius meant in the 18th century. It meant someone who was so gifted, so talented, so intelligent, that it was almost freakish. It was as if nature had almost gone out of its course to produce such a person. They were a prodigy of nature. And I've known actually very few geniuses. When I think of the word genius, I automatically think of Mozart, someone of that category. Not every genius is of that caliber, but I think that Stevenson was one of the few geniuses I've ever known. He was a brilliant pianist. For example, in 1999, at the age of 83, he gave a piano recital of Chopin from memory. It was just astonishing. But in addition to being a gifted performer, he was also a composer. He studied composition with Igor Stravinsky and Howard Hanson. Of course, we remember Stevenson as a very great musicologist. He was a pioneer in the study of Spanish and Portuguese and Latin American music. particularly of the Renaissance. And I will say this much. Once he told me that when he began his study of Spanish music in the early 1950s, he studied the music of Cristobal de Morales because the German musicologists who dominated the discipline at that time only respected Spanish music of the Renaissance. They didn't respect anything else. So that's where he had to start. But eventually, of course, we know that he discovered an immense treasure trove of great music from many parts of the Ibero-American world. Well, like all the geniuses I've known, he was a very complex individual. And I never pretended to understand him, because in order to understand him, I would have had to be a genius too, and I'm not. So I won't pretend that I actually understood him, but I will say this much. He was very supportive and encouraging. The reason, if I've enjoyed any success at all, it's because of the encouragement and the support and the guidance that he gave me. He was very generous. I'll give a couple of instances just so that people know. Once, during my PhD program at UCLA, I actually had no money. It was the first day of the month. I couldn't pay my rent. I couldn't buy food. I had no money. And I was so disturbed by this, I couldn't concentrate. I was in the library and I couldn't really focus on my studies. And Stevenson sensed something was wrong, and he asked me what was wrong. And I told him, and a short time later he gave me a small check, which was, I thought, a very nice thing. Well, Robert Stevenson was single. He remained single his entire life. He was very much like a monk. He led a monk-like existence. He lived in the dormitories in a single room, and he spent most of his time in the library working. He had phenomenal powers of concentration. The UCLA library was a rather noisy place, people interrupting him all the time, including me. But he had phenomenal powers of concentration and was able to get all of his work done despite distractions and interruptions. The other thing about him was that he wasn't a fashionista by any means. He wore the same clothes, the same shoes, the same suit, the same shirt, the same tie, until they were literally worn out. In fact, once I observed that he had wrapped some tape around his shoes because they were coming apart. Now, he was not a crazy person, because I asked him, I said, well, when you go to Brazil, for instance, do you dress like that? And he said, yes, because then they assume I have no money and I have no problems with people on the street. So everything was calculated for effect. He knew exactly what he's doing. So what was he doing with all the money he was making? He was saving it. Eventually he endowed a lecture series. He was able to endow a scholarship. He used his money for purposes like that rather than spending it on luxuries. He didn't own a car. He would take a bus downtown Los Angeles to get a $5 haircut. I could go on and on. I won't. You get the idea. Well, I had been studying early music in Germany, and so a number of the professors at UCLA specialized in early music, medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque music. Of course, Stevenson also had terrific strengths in those areas, and I think many people assumed that I would do something. I would perhaps write my dissertation on a Renaissance topic. But remember that my first exposure to Spanish music and my real love was flamenco. And I felt a terrific affinity with those Spanish composers who were similarly inspired by Spanish folklore, especially flamenco. One composer in particular interested me, and that was Isaac Albeniz. Now, at that time, in the late 1980s, I feared that if I wrote a dissertation on Isaac Albeniz, I would not be employable. No school would respect such work. Because Albeniz was not considered a major composer. He wasn't Wagner, he wasn't Verdi, he wasn't Beethoven, he wasn't Mozart. And the general idea at the time was, this may seem ridiculous now, but I have to tell you that one professor in particular said, write on a mainstream topic now, you can do what you love later. Well, I didn't like that idea at all. And so I said to Stevenson one day, I said, you know, I would really like to write a dissertation on Albeniz, but I'm afraid that I'll never get a job if I do. He said, well, that might be the truth, but it's wide open. The area is wide open, waiting for someone to do it. Then one other professor who was of a rather traditional and conservative stripe musicologically, and who was a brilliant and prominent specialist in Italian Renaissance music, said, you know, it's true that you might not get a job if you do what you really love now, which is Albeniz. But he said, the tragedy is, if you don't do it, who will? And at that moment, I set aside my doubts and my fears, and I became 100% committed to writing a dissertation about Isaac Albeniz, and that, again, changed my life. Well, of course, since my teenage years, I had played transcriptions of Albeniz's music on the guitar. So I knew many of the piano works in guitar transcription. But I also felt that there must be more to Albeniz than that. Of course, those are very great pieces, but I was curious to know if he'd written other sorts of music other than for the piano. And as I read up on Albeniz, I discovered that, in fact, he wrote a number of operas. He wrote a number of stage works. One, Zarzuela, has come down to us, has survived, and several operas. And that, in fact, he invested a lot of his energy and enthusiasm and time and money and love in writing operas. But in all of the secondary literature I read, the general idea was that these were a waste of time. In fact, one French biographer said they were abortions, that they were a complete waste of time and had produced nothing of any real and lasting value. Well, I didn't think that was possible. How could the composer of Iberia, of Cantos de España, have written something that was an abortion? No, I didn't think that was possible. So I determined to go to Spain and examine the manuscripts of his operas. One opera in particular intrigued me, Pepita Jimenez, because it was clearly the kind of opera one would expect Albeniz to compose. It was based on a Spanish novel. It was set in Cordoba, in Andalusia. And probably, I had no way of knowing at the time, but probably was full of the local color and Spanish quality that we love so much in his piano works. So I decided to write my dissertation on Pepita Jimenez, but also on the other stage works as well, to examine Albeniz as a composer of opera. I first traveled to Spain in 1990. I stayed for 6 months, but I had to spend about half of that time traveling throughout Europe. What I soon discovered was that Albeniz loved to travel, and he had spent about half of his life outside the country. He lived, for instance, in London from 1890 to 1893. Then he lived in Paris from 1894 until his death in 1909. Also, his operas were produced in places like Brussels and Paris and Prague, as well as Barcelona and Madrid. And they were published, some of his works were published in Leipzig. So I had to travel to all of these places. There was no internet for me to use at the time. Nothing had been digitized. The only way to uncover this history was to go to the places where the documentation had survived. If it had survived at all, I didn't know. So I would go to Prague or Leipzig and start asking people where places were and go there and see what they had. Yes, well, I enjoy biography. I've always enjoyed reading historical biography. There's nothing more interesting to me than beautiful music and the intersection of that music with the life of the person who wrote it and the culture and society in which that person created the music. Where those three things intersect, the music, the person, and the culture, that's where I like to be as a as a musicologist. Already in 1992, as I was graduating, I approached Oxford University Press about a biography of Albeniz, and they were very interested. In fact, the editor there had already asked someone else to write a biography of Albeniz, but when he saw my dissertation, he realized that I was much more advanced, and so he said, I'll have that person do something else, you do this. That was terrific, but that book came out in 1999. But the following year, in 1993, I was approached by Garland Publishing to contribute a book on Albeniz to their series, which was called A Guide to Research. It was a composer-based series. People wrote guides to research on particular composers. They wanted one on Albeniz, and they approached me to write that. That book came out in 1998. It was, in a sense, a sort of sketch study. I thought, well, as long as I'm doing all this bibliography anyway, I might as well get a book out of it. So what it consisted of was a shorter biography and then an annotated bibliography of all of the secondary sources, and I also included primary sources and all of the hundreds of reviews that I had found in newspapers in London, Brussels, Paris, Prague, Barcelona, Madrid. I mean, it was quite a bit of work, and I was able then to get 2 books out of Albeniz rather than 1. And as far as finding a job, in that same year, in 1993, I was hired by the University of Kansas as an assistant professor, precisely because they liked the work that I had done on Albeniz. I had a book contract, and they saw potential there for an expansion into Latin American music, which they very much wanted. I always tell my students, there are 2 vectors. One is what you love, and 2 is what we need to know, what hasn't already been done to death. Where those vectors intersect is where you should work. And all right, maybe you really love the piano sonatas of Mozart. Maybe you've discovered an unknown piano sonata by Mozart. That's terrific. But what will happen is after you've completed your dissertation, you'll take your place at the end of a very long line of well-established Mozart scholars. But, as luck would have it, after I finished my work on Albeniz, I took my place at the head of a line of a fairly short line of established Albeniz scholars. And Albeniz naturally led to many other things. Granados, for one thing. Well, I've always loved Granados' music. Elizabeth Taylor once said, I wouldn't trust a woman who doesn't love diamonds. I wouldn't trust somebody who doesn't love the music of Granados. I just wouldn't. It became clear to me during my research on Albeniz that they were complementary figures. They were quite different, really, in their orientation. Albeniz was focused on Andalusia and flamenco, whereas Granados' emphasis was more on Madrid in the time of Goya, Goyescas. These represented complementary aspects of Spanish history, culture, identity. They had complementary personalities. Albeniz was very outgoing, very talkative. Granados was more reserved, more shy. Albeniz had an international career. He was a virtuoso, performed in Berlin and London and Paris, and whereas Granados spent most of his life, almost all of his life, in Barcelona. He was also a very great pianist, but he didn't have an international career as a pianist the way Albeniz did. So they were complementary figures, but my feeling was that in order to understand Spanish nationalism around 1900, it would be necessary to study both of them, to understand both aspects. Well, they both wrote songs, although in very different styles. Granados is famous, of course, for his tonadillas, which were an expression of his love of Goya and music in the time of Goya in the late 18th, early 19th centuries in Madrid. Albeniz's songs, by contrast, reveal the influence of the French mélodie and are quite different in style. And for the most part, most of them don't have the same sort of Spanish flavor one finds in the piano collections or in Pepito Jimenez. But they're very lovely and actually very challenging for the piano. But those who are lovers of French music will find them to be very similar to works by Fauré and others of that time. Both of them strove to write for the stage. Both of them composed operas with mixed success. And I think in both cases we need to reevaluate their contributions as composers for the stage. Now, in the case of Albeniz, at least in part as a result of my research and the research of Jacinto Torres, a very great Spanish musicologist, various conductors in Spain took up the challenge of reviving these works. Pepito Jimenez was revised, Henry Clifford was revived and recorded, and also Merlin, part of an Arthurian trilogy that he never completed. In the case of Granados, well, everyone is familiar with the opera Goyescas, which was in fact based on the piano suite. The suite was composed first, and then Goyescas was fashioned from it. But in fact, he composed a number of other stage works. One work in particular I've just published an edition of is called Follet. It's a 3-act opera in Catalan with a libretto by Albeniz Mestres, who was a very prominent Barcelona artist and illustrator and writer. And this is an amazing work, really, and a perfect musical expression of the spirit of modernisme in Barcelona at that time. So this is a work that I hope will be recorded soon. Now that it's been published, it's available. I think that there are very good prospects for its being recorded, perhaps not staged anytime soon, but at least recorded. And he also wrote some operettas in Catalan, some lighter stage works that are almost completely unknown, but again in this sort of modernist style, modernist spirit, with texts by Mestres. But another work that he composed was an opera in Spanish, Maria del Carmen, with a libretto by Josep Feliu y Codina, a Catalan author who had moved to Madrid, who became fluent in Castellano and took a real interest in the folklore of Murcia, and he'd written a play, Maria del Carmen, and he and Granados worked on transforming that into an opera which premiered in 1898. Well, when I was finished with the 2 books on Albeniz, I already knew that I was going to do something on Granados, and what you quickly discover is that if you write one book that's successful, it's much easier than to get published a second time. So Oxford was already interested in my proposal for a biography of Granados. It's called Enrique Granados, Poet of the Piano, and it's titled that way not because I have some love of being a poet of the piano, but because that's how he was referred to at the time. That the press in Barcelona repeatedly referred to him as a poet of the piano. He thought of himself as something more than just a musician. He thought of himself as an artist, and in fact, the highest calling for a pianist, a composer, was to be a poet. There's such a great reverence for and love of literature in Spain, which has such a deep and rich and long heritage of great literature. But the highest thing you could be was a poet. And that was the highest compliment that anyone could pay him, that he was a poet of the piano. And so I decided to subtitle the book Poet of the Piano. I had to come back to Barcelona. Of course, I always enjoy doing that. And in fact, came back 2 or 3 times to complete my research on Granados. I had to work in Madrid as well. It was a little bit easier because Granados didn't travel the way Albeniz did, so I didn't have to follow him all over Europe. But I will say this, just for the benefit of anyone who's thinking about writing a second book. Stevenson had once told me, every book is different. And of course, Stevenson had written many books, and he knew. I filed that little bit of wisdom away in my mind. What I discovered was that when I was in Barcelona examining the materials in the Museo de la Música, they have most of the Granados archive, I realized that I was essentially attempting to write the Albeniz book all over again. And I had a crisis. one evening when I realized that the materials I was examining, the information that I was gathering, did not fit into that mold. And so I went for a long walk. One of the great things about Barcelona is that you can go for long walks at night. I left my hotel at midnight, went for a 2-hour walk through the city, which is a wonderful thing to do, and many people do this all the time. So you don't feel that, unlike an American city, you're not in any real danger at all. I walked for a long time and I thought, and then I realized that I would have to completely restructure this book. It wasn't going to work the way the other one had worked. And so I went back to my hotel room and came up with a completely new table of contents, a completely new outline of the book, a completely new organization and structure. And after that I had no more problems. Everything that I found, every letter, every review, every photograph, now would fit very comfortably into my new structure, my new design. And in all my subsequent work, I've tried to keep that in mind, to forget what I've done before in a way, and start anew as if this were my very first book. And you have to approach every subject anew, afresh, because it's like working with a piece of wood. Every piece of wood has its own grain, it has its own structure, and you have to respect that grain, you have to respect that inherent structure in the wood. In the case of Albeniz, basically the narrative proceeded in strictly chronological order, and I would discuss his music in the same chapter in which I continued the narrative of his life. The narrative arc of his life very conveniently contained any sort of discussion of the music he was writing, because Albeniz went through a very logical sort of evolution. You have his early works, and then there's a kind of middle phase, and then there are the mature works like La Vega and Iberia and Pepita Jimenez. Wasn't the case with Granados. Granados was a much different composer. And what was frustrating me, what was making this so difficult for me, was that Granados wrote in 3 distinct styles at the same time. It's not that he did this style, then that style, then that style. What was making me crazy was the fact that he did all 3 styles at the same time. Granados was a very great pianist, and he loved the music of Schumann in particular. Robert Schumann exerted a huge influence on Granados. He loved the music of Chopin. In other words, he loved the music of the Central European Romantic composers. And he composed in that style throughout his career. He also loved traditional Spanish music, so he wrote a set of 12 Spanish dances. And then in the 1890s, he came under the spell of Goya and music in the time of Goya and so on. And so he began to cultivate a style that was influenced by 18th century musical models. And at the same time he was doing the Central European thing and the Goya thing, he was also increasingly involved in Catalan modernism, writing stage works, songs and operas using Catalan texts, collaborating very closely with Pelés Mestres. I think I've earned the right to make bold statements, and I will make this bold statement that Enrique Granados would never have been Enrique Granados if he had spent his life in Madrid or Paris or London. There's only one place that could have produced an Enrique Granados, and that place is Barcelona. Because, first of all, he would never have come under the spell of Catalan modernism and collaborated with the Pelés Mestres and produced Follet, for one thing, or Blanca Flor, or Liliana, or any of the other Catalan works he produced. Having said that, Granados was not ethnically Catalan. His ancestors had come from, well, Santander and Cuba. He even had some Mexican ancestry. His family had a long history of military service, of service in the army. His father, brother, and grandfather were officers in the Spanish army. And he felt a great deal of loyalty to the Spanish crown. So not only did he have a strong sense of his Catalan identity culturally, and of being a citizen of Barcelona and an important part of its culture as a teacher, a conductor, a concert organizer, a composer. But he also felt very strongly a sense of Spanish identity. Beyond that, he also had a strong sense of himself as a European. And he felt that the tradition, the heritage of Schumann and Chopin was as much his as anyone else's, which of course it was. But you have to understand something about Barcelona's geographical situation, and I always believe that geography is destiny. Barcelona is a seaport, and it's a seaport that communicates directly with Italy, with France, and historically has always been very attuned to trends and fashions and developments in the rest of Europe. So that even though Granados had a somewhat conservative musical temperament, a very late romantic kind of musical temperament, he was very sensitive to and attuned to developments and trends in other places. And I think that his threefold personality as a composer, the Central European, the Catalan, and the Madrileño, were possible because of the cultural situation in which he found himself, a culture that I think is in some respects unique in Barcelona. Well, I just published a third biography on Federico Moreno Torroba. You see, I'm moving in a sort of geographical progression. Albeniz was very Parisian. He spent the last 15 years of his life in Paris, so he was an expatriate. And I moved down to Barcelona and researched Granados, who spent most of his life in Barcelona. Federico Moreno Torroba is famous as a composer of guitar music. Neither Albeniz nor Granados wrote a single note of music for the guitar. Their music is associated with the guitar, but only in transcription. They did not write for the instrument. Torroba wrote a great deal of music for the guitar, and his music forms one of the essential pillars in the guitar's repertoire. But above and beyond that, he was a very successful composer for the stage. He was the composer of dozens of zarzuelas, some of the most famous and successful zarzuelas of all time. Now, I want to say this, that I research a composer not because I already know a lot about that composer and his or her music, but because I want to know, I want to learn. Being a scholar is essentially being a student, but by other means. I write about something because I don't know as much about it as I would like to know, and I need an excuse to learn. And I did not know as much about the zarzuela as I wanted to know, and as a consequence I co-authored a book on Moreno Torroba with William Krauss, an eminent musicologist in the United States, who wrote his dissertation on this subject, and we teamed up to do this. It was a lot of work because Torroba lived to be 91 years old. Both Granados and Albeniz died just short of their 49th birthdays, and Torroba remained active right up to the end of his life, so this was a huge job. But of course, Torroba spent almost his entire life in Madrid. So I've gone from Paris to Barcelona to Madrid, and now the biography, my final biography, the last one in a tetralogy of biographies, covering the period basically 1860 to the present time, 2013, 2014, is on the Romero family of guitarists. I know them, I studied with Pepe and Celine, but I think that they are also a very important cultural phenomenon in the history of Spanish music of the 20th century, and also in the history of music of the United States in the 20th century. They represent in a very significant way the intersection of Spanish and American cultures at a time when I was growing up. And it was exactly that intersection that inspired me to discover and to explore Spanish music. In a sense, this biography is a kind of autobiography. I want to understand what happened when the Romeros arrived in the United States in 1957. The Romeros traveled all over the United States, playing not only in Carnegie Hall and the major concert venues in Los Angeles and Chicago and other places, but also in every little pueblo, every little village and town across the country, in Montana and South Dakota and Oklahoma. It's unbelievable. They would drive. They would drive in a car with their guitars and their clothes and so on, and they would go from one town to the next And what were they doing? They were taking with them fandangos and malagueñas and tárrega and albeniz and Granados, and they were taking with them Spanish Renaissance music and Bach, their transcriptions of Bach. And in a sense, planting these seeds all over the United States, planting these seeds of Spanish music, of classical music, in places where the great artists like Segovia, and I have the greatest respect for Segovia, but he would never give a concert in Norman, Oklahoma, or Billings, Montana, or someplace like that. The Romeros were giving 100, 150 concerts a year in places like that, and they were cultural ambassadors. And I think they were part of this wave of interest in Spanish music in the 1960s, in which I got caught up, and it's the reason I'm talking to you now. The father was very well known. He had been concertizing in Spain since the 1920s, but especially in the 1930s and the 1940s, early 1950s. He was considered to be one of Spain's leading guitarists. And I've read reviews of his performances. He played all over the country. The sons, Celine and Pepe and Angel, showed early talent, but their careers didn't really begin until they arrived in the United States. And the idea of a guitar quartet didn't exist until they arrived in the United States. The Romero Guitar Quartet was born in California. It was not born in Spain. And it didn't take very long. A few years after they left Spain in 1957, the Spanish press was reporting on their incredible success in the United States. They were playing Carnegie Hall. They were playing all the major venues in the United States. They were appearing on television and radio. This was an incredible phenomenon. A father who was himself considered to be in the same league as Segovia, and then his three sons, who were all phenomenal virtuosos in their own right. They began to make recordings. What made them exceptional in the recordings and their concerts was that they played the classical repertoire. They would do transcriptions of Bach and Telemann. I mean, Celedonio had to create a new repertoire for guitar quartet, and that consisted mostly of transcriptions in the beginning. Later on, he inspired composers like Rodrigo and Torroba to write pieces for guitar quartet, but in the beginning he depended on transcriptions of Bach, Telemann, Vivaldi. They would do concertos by the great German Baroque composers they loved so much, but also they would play fandangos and malagueñas. They could improvise these things. Pepe is an incredible flamenco guitarist. They could do all of these things, and they played the mainstream Spanish classical repertoire, starting with the Renaissance. They would play pieces by the Vihuela composers such as Milan, Narváez, Mudarra, and then they would move on to Gaspar Sanz and Fernando Sor and Francisco Tárrega, and then the 20th century masters, Torroba and Rodrigo and others. This kind of programming was really very different from what any other guitarist was doing at the time, including Segovia. They were able to interpret with authority and grace and charm not only the classical repertoire but also the traditional repertoire of Andalusia. After all, they came from Malaga. They'd grown up playing malagueñas, hearing flamenco in every bar and restaurant in town. This was in the marrow of their bones. They knew it very well. They were the only ones who could do that, and frankly, I think they're the only ones who were ever able to do it convincingly, to do it really well. Well, I think 2016 is probably a reasonable expectation. I would like it to come out before 2017, which will be the 60th anniversary of their arrival in the United States. This year, 2013, is the 100th anniversary of Celedonio's birth. He was actually born in Cienfuegos, Cuba, where his father was working at the time, but the family was from Malaga, and after a few years in Cuba, they moved back to Malaga, and they're very closely associated with that city. So I've been doing quite a bit of research there, and having a great time. So you see, I've moved from Albeniz in Paris, a very international figure, to Barcelona and Granados, to Madrid and Torroba, and finally to Andalusia and Malaga and the Romeros. So there are a lot of events being planned and publications. I'm looking forward to a Spanish publication of my Granados biography and publication of my edition of Maria del Carmen. You've asked about other things I've done. In the course of my career, I've expanded into Latin American music as well. Co-edited the first ever textbook on Latin American music that treats folk, popular, and classical styles, recently published by Norton in New York. I also edited a volume on Latin American popular music. It's called From Tejano to Tango, Latin American Popular Music. And my chapter deals with Carmen Miranda. I'm a huge fan of Carmen Miranda and her Hollywood musicals. I've also written a lot on the guitar, and it was also a great privilege for me to co-edit a book dedicated to Robert Stevenson dealing with music of the Iberian and Latin American Renaissance of the 16th century, principally 15th and 16th centuries. A collection of essays by very eminent scholars. That book came out 3 months before Robert Stevenson passed away in December of last year of 2012. And he saw the book, was very pleased with it. So you can imagine that was a very emotional moment for me. And to beat my drum a little more, I was very pleased in 2006 when my Granados biography won the Robert M. Stevenson Award, endowed by Robert M. Stevenson with all that money he was saving on haircuts. Won the Robert M. Stevenson Award for Iberian Musicology from the American Musicological Society. That was a high point in my life. Well, I spent 10 years at the University of Kansas, and they had a very prominent Center of Latin American Studies there, and I developed a course on Latin American music for them. A course examining folk, popular, and classical styles, and that became the inspiration for the textbook later on. And it was during that time also that I was asked by Routledge to edit a volume on Latin American popular music, and that came out in 2002. So in 2003, the University of California at Riverside, which is near Los Angeles, advertised for someone, for a musicologist with a specialization in Latin America. This was highly unusual. I'd never seen that before. It's not unusual for ethnomusicologists to work in Latin America and to respond to job announcements in their particular area of expertise, but I had never seen a job for a historical musicologist with a specialty or specialization in Latin America. So I applied for that job. I got that job, and what I proposed to do and what they supported me in doing was to create a Center for Iberian and Latin American Music, whose purpose would be to promote this vast and very rich tradition of great music, stretching from the Iberian Peninsula to the Americas to the Philippines. And so we do a number of things. We have, for the past 10 years, we've sponsored, organized, and presented annual encuentros, encounters, dealing with some particular aspect of this heritage. This involves a day-long conference. We bring scholars in from Latin America, from Spain, Portugal, and even the Philippines to discuss this, the particular focus of the encounter, and then we'll have 1 or 2 or 3 concerts in addition. Done this for 10 years in a row. We've looked at Goya and Spanish nationalism. We've looked at music and politics in the Andes, at the influence of the Mexican son beyond Mexico. We've looked at music during the colonial period in the Philippines, music and race in Brazil. We had a very good encounter on the music and musicians of the California missions. The 2012 encounter dealt with the Romero family, and a most recent encounter this year focused on the tango. Everyone's favorite is the Argentine tango. Next year's encounter in February is going to focus on medieval Iberia and the confluence of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim cultures in Iberia during that time. I think it's going to be wonderful. But in addition to that, we created a doctoral program. We now have a number of students who are working on dissertations, doing advanced research on music of the Philippines, music of Latin America. One of our students is doing brilliant work on flamenco. So I'm very happy about that. We also sponsor occasional concerts and lectures by other people. And we are launching an online journal. We've housed the proceedings of our Encuentros conferences in our journal Diagonal. Now we want to transform that into a peer-reviewed journal that will accept submissions from scholars around the world in Spanish, Portuguese, or English that are not connected to our annual encounters. We're doing a number of things. We've created a scholarship for students to help them in their research, and I think that in the past 10 years we've transformed the music department at UC Riverside into a major center for the study of Ibero-American music. In addition to myself, we have Leonora Saavedra, a leading Mexican musicologist who specializes in 20th century Mexican music and politics. We have Rogério Budas, a leading Brazilian musicologist whose specialty is colonial music of Brazil and Latin America. Jonathan Ritter is an ethnomusicologist who is a leading expert and a rising star in ethnomusicology, specializing in music of the Andes, music and politics, music and violence in the Andean nations, where he's done considerable research. He directs our Mayu Patapi ensemble, Andean ensemble, in which I play the charango, I'm happy to say. We also have a composer. Paulo Chagas is a brilliant composer from Brazil. So we have 5 people specializing in various aspects of Ibero-American music, and I think that we're probably unique in that sense. We have a studio for Mexican music and dance, in addition to our Mayo Patapi Andean ensemble, and we also have a Philippine Rondalla ensemble. So I'm very proud of our program, and I'm very optimistic about what the future holds. The Barcelona Festival of Song is the focusing attention on a much neglected aspect of this entire Ibero-American tradition. When we think of the Lied, I was recently in Vienna, we always think of Schubert and Schumann, understandably. I mean, we all love Schubert and Schumann, who doesn't? Brahms, Hugo Wolf, and so on. But it's important to understand that there's a rich tradition of song in Iberian Latin America as well. And many composers of deeply moving works, finely crafted. It simply requires energy, a particular kind of genius to explore and promote this, and that sort of energy and particular sort of genius have incarnated in the form of one Patricia Caicedo.
So, thank you very, very much for all your sharing with us these thoughts and of your life and your experience.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.